3703, Study Unit 1. Forms of Knowledge. 1.1. Political Knowledge. Political knowledge is knowledge of political life, which assumes different forms ranging from knowledge of who the leaders of political parties are and how to vote during an election to knowledge of the provisions of a country's constitution. Political knowledge is often characterized by strong convictions about right and wrong and by knowledge of how to act to bring about a desired situation or avoid an undesirable situation. Consequently, political knowledge is often colored by convictions that are emotionally highly charged. Knowledge of what may be right or wrong in politics is called political morality. This type of knowledge is distinct from both factual knowledge and knowledge of how to make something happen or prevent it from happening. In practice, however, the different forms of political knowledge are used interactively, that is, in relation to each other. Political knowledge is sometimes also referred to as political ideology. In the broadest sense, a political ideology is a set of values, convictions, and strategies according to which political life has to be understood and changed or maintained. Conservatism, liberalism, and anarchism are examples of political ideologies. In politics, conservatism as a form of political knowledge is an ideology that presupposes that good can be found in tried and tested experience and that any deviation from the lessons of history should be treated with great circumspection. The premise of liberalism is the conviction that the state and government have to impose only a minimum set of constraints on the freedom of the individual. Anarchism is a political ideology that proceeds from the premise that the role and influence of the state and government in public life are redundant. Political knowledge, in all its forms, enables people to take political action. In a sense, all political action stems from human decisions, and such decisions are influenced by political knowledge. Political actions fail in some instances and succeed in others. Political errors are often made for lack of sufficient knowledge and understanding of a matter. On the other hand, successful political actions or policies are often the result of accurate knowledge of and good insight into the matter. Political knowledge is a type of practical wisdom derived from experience, which is why political knowledge does not necessarily require scientific and philosophical insight. Scientific or philosophical knowledge that supplements political knowledge is not necessarily a guarantee for virtue or good political action, because although it could enrich political knowledge, it may also be misleading. 1.2. Political Science. The study object of political science is politics in the sense of the political knowledge and action referred to above. Its purpose is not only to study political life in order to act politically, however. Scientific knowledge may be used for the purposes of action. Its primary purpose, however, is to understand and explain political life. Predictions and appreciations concerning political life are intrinsic to gaining scientific knowledge of it. A variety of cognitive instruments are used to this end, including descriptions, generalizations, approaches, explanations, models, theories, and value systems. Just as political knowledge can assume a variety of forms, political science is also a collective name for different forms of science that study political life. On the one hand, there are different forms of political science that try to emulate the methods of the natural sciences. These forms of political science proceed from the conviction that mainly the observable behavior of people who act politically should be studied, and that such behavior is not necessarily classifiable as good or bad. On the other hand, some forms of political science proceed from the view that elements of political life that are not observable should also be studied, and that political science may not stand aloof from that which is good or bad in political life. On the whole, the knowledge produced by political science is logically coherent and can be tested. In cases where knowledge does not meet these requirements, we could maintain that it has tried but failed to meet them. Logical coherence means that facts and claims concerning political life do not contradict each other. The fact that something can be tested means that, in principle, scientists should achieve reproducible results in the sense of arriving at the same observations and conclusions. There is no agreement about exactly which aspects of political life should be studied by political science. Political scientists also disagree in their interpretations or perceptions of what they study, and these disagreements largely explain why political science is divided into different orientations. You may find it unsettling that scientists do not always agree about their priorities or the rules of science, but as you will see later, such disagreement actually guarantees and acts as the driving force behind renewable new insights and fruitful diversity. 1.3. Political philosophy. Like political science, political philosophy also studies political life, but it does this differently, and there are different forms of knowledge and inquiry or traditions in political philosophy. Political philosophy has a long historical tradition as a form of reflection on the sense and meaning of political life. Political philosophy has a long historical tradition that can be traced back to Plato and Aristotle. It can be said that the object pursued by political philosophy is to use observation, and more particularly reason, to try and discover the timeless truths of political life. Unlike political science, political philosophy seeks to view and interpret political life against the background of life as a whole. On the whole, the object of political philosophy is to explain specific political phenomena in terms of general ideas about politics. According to political philosophy, general ideas or truths concerning politics are not limited by time or space, but tend to expose the essence of political problems so that reality can be understood and judged accordingly. Fuck. A typical example of a problem dealt with by political philosophy is the question whether there are ideas and truths about justice that could be valid for our political systems. Do such ideas or truths exist, or are there different truths about justice that should be valid for different political systems and periods of history? A typical example of a problem dealt with by political philosophy is the question whether there are ideas and truths about justice that could be valid for all political systems. Do such ideas exist, or are there different truths about justice that should be valid for different political systems and periods of history? Like political science, political philosophy is no longer neutral towards the importance of logical reasoning and observable political reality, but it differs from political science in that it generally allows more space for rational thought as a source of knowledge. Whereas political science is mainly interested in the logical coherence of political life, political philosophy takes the matter a step further by also connecting it to the world of abstract ideas and then examining this relationship. The result of this characteristic of political philosophy is that it mainly focuses on the eternal issues that occur in all walks of life, such as the nature of authority, justice, freedom, legitimacy, and the like. 1.4 Philosophy of Science. Philosophy of science is a form of knowledge that differs from all the other forms of knowledge we have spoken of so far, and yet it is closely related and largely owes its existence to them. Whereas political science and political philosophy study political life, the philosophy of science studies political science and political philosophy as forms of knowledge. In a general sense, the philosophy of science concerns itself with all the sciences that study reality, including the social and natural sciences. Political science and political philosophy can be classified under the social sciences. Rather than politics, therefore, philosophy of science studies, among others, the sciences that study political life. Philosophy of science developed rapidly towards the end of the 19th century and exerted a marked influence on the practice of social and natural sciences during the 20th century. One could say that a number of social sciences reflect schools of thought in the philosophy of science that pronounce on how science should be practiced. Some social scientists resisted this trend, arguing that the philosophy of science has no particular cachet or authority to prescribe to them how science should be practiced. They contended that social reality should naturally indicate how sciences should be practiced, and that the philosophy of science was alienated from reality. Despite this criticism, however, philosophy of science exercises a strong influence on the sciences, including political science. Philosophy of science is particularly interested in the origin, methods, structure, and validity of scientific knowledge, and debates about this subject matter have exercised a marked influence on the nature of political science. Note that none of the forms of knowledge discussed above exist in isolation. There is constant interaction between all these forms of knowledge, and the distinctions made here are merely analytical. These distinctions help us understand the nature of the various forms of knowledge and illustrate the interaction between the different forms of knowledge. And then find a diagram on the screen right now. PSC 3703, Study Unit 2. The Origin and Validity of Scientific Knowledge. 2.1. The Origin and Validity of Knowledge. One may well ask how scientific knowledge originates or is discovered, as well as why such knowledge should be valid. Are there rules that can be followed in order to demonstrate the validity of science? These questions imply a clear distinction between questions on the origin and questions relating to the validity of scientific knowledge. Before we attend to each of these questions, it is important to understand that there is constant interaction between the origin of scientific knowledge and the verification or falsification of such knowledge as valid or invalid. New insight and knowledge are constantly subjected to testing, and valid as well as invalid knowledge are instrumental in the discovery of further new insights and knowledge, and so on. 2.1.1 The Origin of Knowledge. We have mentioned that scientific knowledge may arise from reflection, reasoning, experience, and observation. These are called sources of knowledge, and we shall revert to them later in the study guide. The use of these sources of knowledge by scientists is no guarantee in itself that new discoveries will be made. Discoveries could quite simply be described as new or unique insights into and perspectives on how elements of reality and or abstract ideas relate to each other. There are probably many such insights that will never gain the status of discoveries because they do not become known or are not useful or significant. Scientific insights are usually referred to as discoveries when the scientific community acclaim them and they pass the test of validity. Such discoveries are usually stated in a simplified form as hypotheses. A hypothesis usually takes the form of if A under conditions X, Y, and Z, then B, which means that if A is present under certain circumstances, then B will also be present, or it would be reasonable to expect it to be present. For example, if rural populations are urbanized under favorable conditions, they can be expected to participate in political life on a larger scale. The question here is, how does a scientist arrive at such an insight? Are there logical or other procedures, as mentioned earlier, that can motivate him or her to formulate such a hypothesis? To answer this question, we have to push back the cognitive process of science and ask at each juncture, how do we get to that? The answers to these questions are complicated, and the scientist often seems to make certain assumptions about how the elements of concrete and abstract reality relate to each other. Assumptions reflect knowledge that is assumed without proof, and such assumptions are usually based on more profound assumptions of a general nature. This process of arguing backwards is sometimes called retroduction, but it is usually brought up short by the problem of infinite regression, which is the process of reasoning back without arriving at a satisfactory answer, because everything becomes more and more vague and uncertain. We can therefore not fully reconstruct the rules of argument in order to arrive at the moment of new or unique insight. We maintain that there is no recipe or set of logical rules for making discoveries. We can reason from known knowledge, but we cannot argue logically backwards from such knowledge to arrive at the moment of insight and discovery where unknown knowledge becomes known. This does not mean that logic plays no role in the process. It merely means that such a role cannot be clearly demonstrated. The structure and process of discoveries remains enigmatic in many respects. It has been suggested, for example, that the psychology, psychiatry, history, and sociology of science could shed more light on the subject, or that the phases of reflection, restlessness, and tension that often precede the process of discovery for well-known scientists should be examined more closely. The role of subconscious and unconscious thought in the whole process is also not entirely clear. There is much more agreement that scientists have to work with a presupposition or assumption about the nature of reality in this process. The assumption may be made consciously or unconsciously, but scientific knowledge is impossible without the assumption that reality conforms to a fixed pattern or order of some sort. Regardless of the nature of this assumed pattern of orderliness, it is the assumption that makes generalization possible. Without the assumption, all our knowledge would merely be a set of unrelated stimuli. The assumption is therefore critical, and as we will show later, generalization plays an important role in the entire scientific process. 2.1.2 The validity of knowledge. Unlike the untestable nature of knowledge that is implied in the process of origination, all scientific knowledge that is made explicit or known is subject to proof of validity. This comprises the activities, rules, procedures, and evidence that come into play when the arguments and public claims made by scientists are verified or falsified. Validity is one of the principal issues of science because it is decisive for the ultimate acceptance or rejection of scientific knowledge. Scientific claims take various forms, such as hypotheses, statements, descriptions, generalizations, explanations, predictions, theories, and evaluations. Logic plays a crucial role in the entire process of testing. Some philosophers of science contend that the tests for logical validity are exactly the same for social as well as natural sciences, while others feel that in this regard there are critical differences between the two kinds of science. With regard to tests for validity, a clear distinction must be made between the logical correctness of an argument and the correctness of claims or pronouncements about reality. The former is referred to as the analytical component, while the latter is known as the synthetic component of science. The synthetic component is divided into 1. Statements of empirical fact, and 2. Statements that evaluate or judge facts in some way or another. The synthetic component is divided into 1. Statements of empirical fact, and 2. Statements that evaluate or judge facts in some way or other. We distinguish between the two kinds of treatment by calling them synthetic empirical and synthetic normative statements respectively. We now have three categories: analytical, synthetic empirical, and synthetic normative claims that are tested according to different criteria for truth or validity. We begin with a simple explanation of the analytical component, that is, of the logical correctness of an argument. Okay, the argument that all countries that have a presidency have women in that office, that South Africa has a presidency, and that therefore South Africa's president is a woman would be logically correct. We could maintain that the inference is absolutely true, despite our certain knowledge that it is factually not true. In this sense, it is important to realize that logical arguments are either absolutely true or absolutely false. They are not partially true. There are a number of rules according to which logical forms of argumentation can be tested, namely modus ponens, modus tollens, the hypothetical syllogism, the constructive dilemma, and the destructive dilemma. We explain only two sets of rules. The rules of deduction function in that we replace the non-logical elements with symbols so that the basic rules of implication of forms of argument are readily understandable. Modus ponens is one of the best known rules. If Q is implied by P and P is true, it follows that Q is also true. So, for example, Q. All countries with presidencies have women as presidents. P. South Africa has a president. Q. South Africa has a woman as president. The constructive dilemma uses modus ponens to argue that if one of the premises of a combined set of implications is true, then at least one of the two sets of conclusions will also be true. P, Q, R, S. Okay, I'm skipping those. As can be clearly seen from the above examples, the logical correctness of an argument is one thing, but its factual correctness, which cannot be decided by logic, is another matter. The truth of the analytical component is therefore determined by logical inference, while the empirical or factual truth of claims is determined by direct or indirect observation of reality. If we were to maintain that Tony Blair is the current British Prime Minister, or that the Union of South Africa was established in 1910, then logic cannot help us to determine the truth of these statements. We would have to resort to observation or the consultation of historical evidence to test these claims. It is important in this regard to remember that, in contrast to the analytical component of knowledge that can be absolutely true or false, the factual or empirical component of scientific knowledge can only be maximally true. Observation may be defective or even incorrect in principle, and future observation would always be able to refute the facts in principle. On the other hand, the synthetic normative component of science actually has no truth status. If we were to contend that Tony Blair is a good prime minister, the question arises, how can we establish the truth of a good prime minister? In this regard, we could say that there are no objective criteria against which the truth of such statements can be tested, and that they actually have minimal truth status. We shall return to claims of this type and their role and function in science at a later stage. It should be clear to you from the above that the question of the validity of scientific knowledge has different dimensions. Logical or analytical truth differs from synthetic validity, and there is a separate set of rules and procedures or considerations that have to be complied with for each of them. We have to conclude from this that scientific knowledge assumes different forms, and that we have to consider whether we are dealing with logical, empirical, or normative claims, or with combinations of them. We conclude this study unit by pointing out that although there is agreement about the nature of the above-mentioned rules for testing validity, there is no agreement about how they should be applied in science. These differences lead to divergent ideas of how science is practiced and how philosophy of science evaluates such practices. A case in point is the differences of opinion on how much weight should be attached to the whole matter of scientific validity. Another subject for debate is whether scientific claims should be tested for validity, or whether they should rather be tested for invalidity. We shall take a closer look at these issues later in the study guide. Besides these and other rules concerning formal validity, there are a number of procedures for the testing of empirical evidence adduced for claims concerning politics. Political science is not a formalized discipline, and the formal validity of cognitive structures represents a minor subdivision of the complex issues concerning validity and truth. These procedures are related to divergent views on the nature of science and will receive better exposure in the following study units.